not very targeted. In my blog post, I called it belt and suspenders. It's the argument for things like the checks to, to most adults, regardless of economic circumstances, are the economic argument for them is that any attempt to create criteria for targeted aid is going to have gaps in it. And certainly the unemployment benefit has gaps in it. So you're throwing out a bunch of money, much of it going to people who have not been hurt by the pandemic or not significantly hurt, but some of it also going to people who really have but are not getting aid. And so you're throwing some money at them. And it's not well targeted, but trying to be too careful can be a problem. I would be very upset if the whole program or most of the program consisted of untargeted checks, but it doesn't. It's something like a quarter of the program. So those are the three things. And if you want to think about how the program can be so big relative to the income shortfall, you want to say, well, there's the public good stuff, which is not related at all to the income shortfall. There's the income support, which is supposed to be roughly corresponding to the income shortfall. And then there's the sort of the belt and suspenders stuff, which is on top of that. And so it ends up being a very big number. Question we should ask then is, first question we should ask is how much overheating is all this going to cause, or how much stimulus over and above what we sort of need to get through is this going to provide? The public good stuff it's like defense spending in a war, military spending in a war. It's clearly, it's a significant just plus on demand. Necessary as it may be, it is going to be adding to demand. The income support, less so, because to a large extent, maybe not perfectly, but to a large extent, is replacing income loss because of the pandemic. And in fact, if you want to ask what happened last year, it seemed pretty clear that the economy wanted to have a secondary Keynesian recession on top of the pandemic slowdown because there was big loss of income and spillover to demand. And that was short-circuited by the CARES Act, which provided aid and meant supported incomes, and that it supported us. And it really did. It wasn't stimulus in the normal sense, but it did in fact provide a floor under aggregate demand, which was really important. But again, I don't think I'm sorry, not again. The public good spending definitely is expansionary. The income support, I think, is largely just keeping us in place. The broad-based stuff, which is the checks, but also, I agree, it does kind of look as if the state and local aid in particular is bigger than the fiscal problems of state and local governments, certainly in aggregate. Those things are definitely kind of, there's a lot of money. However, it's probably not very stimulative. In fact, it's doing a lot to reassure people, as some of it is helping people in need, and the rest, I mean, I'm not a big believer in Ricardian equivalence, but if there's anything where you can expect that people will just save a temporary increase in income, surely receiving a check that is not compensating for anything and that is a one-time event, a lot of that's going to be saved. There's a fair bit of evidence that happened last year. So that the net impact on aggregate demand is not as big. You look at the $1.9 trillion, this is going to have an aggregate multiplier well under 1. It's not going to be nearly as big as the headline number would suggest. It still is a stimulus on top of an economy. Now, I do think we're going to have a boom, but I don't think it's going to happen until we've got enough vaccination for herd immunity, which means it's going to be coming late in the year. So, I'm very optimistic about late 21 into 22, but not right away. But we're putting something on top of that. And I have to say that I think it's a little, it's true that monetary policy attempting to offset fiscal stimulus actually has sometimes overdone it and led to recessions, and has sometimes underdone it so that inflation starts to take off. And I'm not sure that there's any general principle that says that we should presume that the Fed is in a systematic way unable to handle this. But it will have to do something if things go well. We do have a kind of booming economy. For what it's worth, which may not be much, the markets aren't acting like they're particularly worried about this, but it could be. But I think the other thing that you want to ask is, if you don't, if you're worried about this, what are you suggesting? Which pieces of the relief package, the rescue plan? I was happy to see the Biden people call it that, not a stimulus. Which pieces of the rescue plan would you want to drastically cut back? Not the public goods, pandemic fighting for sure. That's what we really need to do. The unemployment benefits are a bit, they're generous, but not as generous as the $600 a week as in the CARES Act, and it's not that the difference between what you might think was a reasonable compensation and maybe the slightly higher stuff is not a big deal. Generalized checks, yeah, you could. The case for those is the weakest of all the pieces, but they're also not likely to have very much stimulative effect. And the same is true for any excess state and local aid. State and local governments, if they find themselves getting a lot more money than they're going to need, they're not going to have a huge boom in state spending. We're going to have a lot of it used to replenish rainy day funds. So I don't think that that's a big inflationary stuff. And the question has got to be, what are you suggesting that we cut? And of course, it does matter that the checks, which are the least justifiable piece in terms of standard economics, are also by far the most popular. And I don't think we can entirely disregard that. That's part of part of making a successful policy, is making something that you can actually sell.
Thanks.
Can I just add one last point?
Sure.
Larry, I agree that the bigger thing is infrastructure investment. But I don't think that these are competing. Any excess stimulus that we're going to get now is going to be gone by the time any kind of infrastructure program is going to get rolling. Infrastructure stuff is stuff for sometime next year at the earliest. It's just not going to be a competing issue. And let's be realistic. The political economy of this, the constraint on the kind of infrastructure plan that Larry and I both want, is not financial, and it's not macroeconomic. It is political. And it's all about whether we will have enough sense that government programs work to be able to do the things we should be doing next year.
Thanks a lot, Paul. There was a lot of stuff in it. Let me just summarize. So you think the framework of output gap is probably not sufficient to look at this problem. There's more income support rather than a stimulus. That relates to some resilience argument as well, where the households would like to have more resilience, more of liquidity buffers compared to earlier. We know that in the US, it's for many households, they don't have enough liquidity buffers. And perhaps they won't spend it and don't push up the inflation and hold higher liquidity buffers. We don't know. I was intrigued by your war analogy. The timing is a little bit different, no? Because during the war, you spend during the war when others can't spend so much in private consumption. And when the war is over, I think you have to change. Here, it depends very much how the vaccines are rolled out. But I find it so perhaps Larry can respond to it, and let's keep it back and forth short to the questions, the explicit questions you ask, which parts of the stimulus package or the income support package to cut back on, and how do you see the resilience aspects, and how would you redesign the whole thing? And perhaps if I throw something on top of it, you were arguing for secular stagnation, which was an infrastructure. The interest rate staying low. Perhaps you can combine it with your earlier hypothesis of secular stagnation, where you always argued for more government investments in particular, and how does this fit, being now more conservative? How does it fit with the earlier hypothesis of having expansion because of secular stagnation?
So I'm sympathetic to Paul's basic framework. There's about $170 billion in there to spend on vaccines and fighting COVID. And every penny that we can usefully spend, or even half usefully spend fighting COVID, we should spend. I'm for that. Lost labor and salary income is $20 billion a month now, going down over the year. Call that $300 billion to be very generous. We should absolutely spend that. That gets us to $500 billion. There are other categories that you can argue that can be argued about. And so you might get up towards $1 trillion. I think you have a difficult time getting to $1.9 trillion or close to $1.9 trillion on Paul's criteria. When he defends the proposition, which he does in a persuasive way, that this may